Good afternoon, one and all. Very pleased to have you with us. My name is Frank Gaffney. I'm the president of the Center for Security Policy in Washington. We work on a variety of national security issues, and one of those that is a hardy perennial of our work is what Communist China is up to and the threats that it poses to American interests and security, many of which are not properly perceived, we believe. And I think that is almost certainly the case with respect to the topic of our meeting today, which is the Alibaba initial public offering and the economic and financial and possible security implications thereof that apparently have gotten very little attention, or certainly very little critical attention, in official Washington and perhaps in Wall Street as well, despite the fact that this is an imminent transaction, perhaps as early as the beginning of next month, and one that is said by some experts to be the likely largest initial public offering in American history. For reasons that will become clear in the course of the presentations that will follow momentarily, we think that that lack of scrutiny and perhaps regulatory action concerning this initial public offering is a grievous mistake. So we're going to visit about several aspects of this incipient transaction and do so with some of the best in the business. I want to start off by just pointing out a couple of things, as several of the items that are available to you if you haven't seen them outside. Among them is an article by Bloomberg in which the headline reads, Alibaba nears SEC, Securities and Exchange Commission, blessing as the biggest IPO causes few ripples in Washington. Now that is despite the fact that, as the Bloomberg report indicates, questions about the firm's corporate structure, accounting, and sale of counterfeit goods have gone unexplored. It is despite a letter from Senator Robert Casey, a member of the Senate Finance Committee, to the SEC, asking why it is not engaged in rather more critical examination. This is despite a report by the staff of the U.S.-China Economic and Security Review Commission, which has also suggested that there are serious risks associated with this transaction for American investors. But not least, one of the things that caught my attention was a statement from Anant Sundaram, who is described as a corporate governance expert at Dartmouth's Tuck School of Business, in which he says, quote, "This is going to be a watershed IPO. How come nobody at the U.S. Trade Representative, nobody at the Department of Commerce, nobody at some congressional oversight body is saying, quote, guys, what's going on here?" Unquote. It just puzzles me that nobody is concerned. Well, we have several people here who are concerned, and I'm just going to slide over here and grab my notes. These are people who I regard, as I said, as preeminent in their respective fields. They are not necessarily securities and exchange commission professionals exactly, though one is a litigator with considerable experience in securities law. But they're people who are pulled together by us to shed light on other aspects of this transaction that, as I say, we think require attention. The first will be Michelle Van Cleave. She is an attorney by training, but has had extensive experience in government, including serving as the former head of U.S. counterintelligence under President George W. Bush. She was also the staff director of the Senate Judiciary Subcommittee on Technology and an assistant director of White House Science under President Reagan and Bush 41. She is now a principal with the Jack Kemp Foundation, and I've asked her to lead us off with sort of an overview of Communist China's strategic objectives, as best we're able to discern them at the moment, and how this sort of transaction may further them to the detriment of our national security and economic interests. Michelle, welcome. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you, Frank, and good morning, afternoon to everybody. Now, when you hear the when you hear the title of today's gathering, Alibaba and the 40 Thieves, as the press release went out, one cannot help but be reminded of that Persian fairy tale and how it made open sesame a part of the Western lexicon. Well, open sesame might also describe the Chinese intelligence service's approach to Western technologies. It's all a matter of gaining access. The U.S. government's been saying for quite a while that the Chinese have a national policy of economic espionage in cyberspace. And I'd like to take a moment to discuss what that really means. First, it means there's a dedicated enterprise to acquire prioritized technologies or know-how. A government apparatus engaged in highly coordinated tasking and collection activities targeting U.S. technologies and know-how. The FBI estimates that the Chinese Army has developed a network of over 30,000 Chinese military cyber spies, plus another 150,000 private sector computer experts whose mission is to steal American military and technology secrets. Second, specifically targeting key industries to meet requirements as part of a national policy of economic espionage in cyberspace. So China's most recent 5-year plan identified the country's key strategic sectors on which to build its future growth. They're ones that you might think of yourself. Technology, aerospace, telecommunications, energy, transportation, engineering services, and high-tech electronics. Well, these are the same sectors that China's cyber espionage has targeted, although I would hasten to add it's not limited to those. In other words, if they can't develop it indigenously, and they can't acquire it through commerce, then they're prepared to steal it through espionage. Third part of a national policy of economic espionage is strategic investments in the means to get at those targets of interest. So exploiting existing cyber vulnerabilities or implanting vulnerabilities in the supply chain that can be exploited later is a part of this national enterprise. Those cyber collection operations by the Chinese are not undertaken in isolation. Rather, they're integral to a larger national effort. China clandestinely employs commercial firms, front companies, if you will, to acquire controlled technologies they want in violation of U.S. export control laws. They also insert collectors inside of U.S. companies. This is not a casual undertaking. In fact, the Chinese have set up organizations in the United States to track the access of these experts. So, for example, last month, Mr. Liu was sentenced to 15 years in jail and a $15 million fine, plus a $30 million forfeiture for his fine efforts in orchestrating a scheme to illegally obtain DuPont trade secrets through hiring former DuPont employees and selling those secrets to state-owned entities in China. That is just one example, and the examples range from basic research in hybrid corn seed and medicine to advanced space and defense technologies such as the space shuttle, the Delta IV rocket, the B-1 bomber, the Chinook helicopter, propulsion, naval electronics, and the list goes on. Final aspect of a national policy of economic espionage is an economy that is structured to take advantage of state-sponsored industrial espionage. The Chinese government and businesses are often so close together as to be indistinguishable. And there's a rotating door between state-owned enterprises and party officials. Chinese party officials, their official interests and their business interests are often, therefore, the same thing, which helps when it comes to tasking intelligence collection, espionage activities. So economic espionage for the Chinese is driven by two very powerful motives: state power and personal wealth. Last year, the U.S. Commission on Intellectual Property Theft reported that China was responsible for as much as 80% of the intellectual property theft against U.S. companies. Technology theft amounts to a loss of more than $300 billion a year, which is more than the annual U.S. exports to all of Asia combined. For years, the intelligence community has been warning about Chinese cyber activities in very general terms, and private firms have done even more than that, providing chapter and verse about sweeping, persistent global operations. Some of the lead actors have in fact been identified publicly. The Mandiant report, for example, has shown there are more than 20 of these advanced persistent threat groups operating within China under government control, directed against U.S. secrets, proprietary secrets of U.S. industry. So material that's been stolen includes data on product development and use, test results, system design and product manuals, manufacturing procedures, business and strategy plans, negotiations, pricing strategies, details of joint ventures, and so forth and so on. And companies ranging from Coca-Cola to RSA have been targeted. It is quite a wide swath of an attack. And you may recall back in 2009 that there was a group of Canadian researchers who found evidence that China had infiltrated computer systems in 103 countries, ranging from embassies to industries. That sweeping electronic spy network, which was then called GhostNet, acquires vast quantities of data through precision strikes, leaves behind malware capable of taking positive control over the computer's audio recording functions, a sort of eyes and ears stay behind in the room. And that was reported 5 years ago. Do you think that the situation has gotten better since then? More recent specific intrusions into U.S. systems are noteworthy for their range and their audacity, such as the break-in to OPM files just earlier this month. Other examples, in 2012, U.S. prosecutors arrested a Chinese computer programmer on charges that he stole software valued at nearly $10 million from the Federal Reserve, which was software developed to help track the billions of dollars the United States government transfers daily. That same year, Chinese hackers took over functional control of NASA and JPL networks. And last year, the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, Bloomberg News, Washington Post all reported cyber intrusions. It seems that those hackers went after the passwords and the files of reporters who took part in investigations on the wealth accumulated by China's political elite and spying facilitated by Chinese communications devices used in the U.S. and elsewhere. So for those of you who are in the press, in particular, I hope you are taking precautions. I have heard this situation compared to the frog that is boiling slowly in the pot as the temperature rises. So let's stop and take measure of the temperature. It's not that we don't know what's going on. It's that we've been a little slow in deciding what to do about it. So for example, after Mandiant identified the specific PLA unit in Shanghai that was engaged in operations against the US, they expected to see some changes as a result of this public exposure. And for a while, some of those activities seemed to slow down. But then they picked up again, using different tactics, different attack infrastructure, but going against many of the same victims. So in May, the Justice Department issued a 31-count indictment against 5 members of that particular PLA unit on charges of hacking into computers and stealing trade secrets and other sensitive information from leading steel, nuclear power, and solar power firms. Again, there was some hope that the seriousness of bringing criminal charges would get their attention. China denied the charges, then turned around last month, announced the creation of a new PLA cyber research entity charged with doing intelligence research that would help facilitate that same work. So naming and shaming hasn't worked. Diplomacy is the latest effort. We've had recent efforts led by Secretary Kerry to try to gain some diplomatic understanding with the Chinese. But getting rules of the road over this kind of economic intercourse is somewhat inconsistent with a power that has a national policy of economic espionage in cyberspace. Stealing Western technologies and other commercially valuable information is integral to how China's economy works. So it's hard to envision them agreeing to play nice. Of course, they have espionage directed against non-traditional targets, rather against traditional targets as well, and I would not want to minimize those activities, which are quite alarming. But take a moment, lastly, to consider the implications of China's breaking into the Office of Personnel Management databases. What is to be found there? Private personnel files of government employees, including extensive background investigations on individuals who hold high security clearances. Let me tell you, in the spy business, these files are gold. Why? Because they help spot and assess people in positions of access who may be useful either as conduits to friends and colleagues, or cultivated as unwitting sources, or for potential recruitment. There's really no other reason to break into those files than to acquire this kind of personal information about federal employees that may enable these personalized phishing schemes or help facilitate access to more sensitive information. Look, a key point is this. The cyber espionage business and the human espionage business go hand in hand. Access is always the key. Access to computer systems that may enable the implanting of the next nasty bug, access to information about individuals that may prove compromising or otherwise useful to resourceful intelligence services, and make no mistake, the Chinese are really excel in the human espionage business. So as more and more of society's interactions take place online, the value of the internet as an intelligence target goes up. In this way, cyberspace is both a target and a modality. It carries information of value, which may be exfiltrated, and IT systems run critical activities like power distribution and banking and rail transit, and we have certainly seen Chinese cyber operations designed to hold such systems at risk of disruption or damage. Now, a final complicating factor, which is why we're here today. The global internet is migrating more and more of U.S. commerce onto Chinese platforms, which is when Alibaba's motto is pretty interesting. Quote, "Our mission is to make it easy to do business anywhere," close quote. China doesn't play by the existing norms of the global economy, so to them, espionage is part of doing business anywhere. And what I wonder is, does the U.S. government, does the Obama administration, does the Congress have a strategy to deal with that? So Tom Donilon, and the President's National Security Assistant, said, I think we need to have much more private and public cooperation. We need to have an international effort to try to set some norms here. But at the end of the day, we're going to have adversaries, he says, that are going to have increasingly sophisticated approaches to attacking our systems, and I don't think there's any doubt about that. In other words, much of what we've been talking about fits in the category of it's out of our control, which is all the more reason why it is so important to identify those things that are in fact controllable. Security professionals approach the craft as an onion. There are different layers of protection which complement one another. at the level of commercial intercourse among nations and the movement of goods, digits, and people, there are transit points and categories of activity that may warrant pause. There may also be individual transactions or actors who, by their size and presence, merit special attention. None of these in isolation may be significant, but taken together as a coherent, integrated national strategy, it can be effective, at least in making it more difficult for China to succeed in its national policy of stealing whatever it wants.
Thank you, Michelle. You've set the stage for a bit more of a detailed look at this company and its activities and its implications should it become one of the platforms for American business, American consumers, and who knows, even perhaps American government, as it spreads its operations truly worldwide. Next, we're going to talk with Kevin Freeman. Kevin is an investment manager with 30 years experience in global markets, including a decade working for Sir John Templeton of the Templeton Funds. Kevin was asked by the Pentagon back in 2008 to study a very troubling phenomenon, and that is economic warfare. That, as he has established, has been and is indeed being waged against the United States by, among others, it would appear, Communist China. He is the author of two extraordinarily important books, Secret Weapon, How Economic Terrorism Brought Down the U.S. Stock Market and How It Can Happen Again, and Game Plan, How to Protect Yourself from the Coming Cyber Economic Attack. We've asked Kevin to take Michelle's sort of overview and drill down a bit on how this particular company fits into the Chinese strategy of, among other things, economic warfare. Kevin, welcome. Thank you very much for joining us.
Really, I have three main points to share. I am an asset manager by training, and the first point is this Alibaba IPO is a really big deal. And it's not a big deal just figuratively, it's a big deal literally. $20 billion IPOs do not happen. The largest IPO to date was Facebook, and the amount of capital raised in that plus Twitter together would not equal what's being taken down potentially by Alibaba. In fact, it's 10 times. The Alibaba expected amount that they take in is 10 times approximately what Twitter took in. So it is a very big deal for a company that most Americans have probably not even heard of. It's a milestone offering in the United States. It provides massive capital to an already acquisitive company. And one of the things that came out in the staff report for the U.S. China Economic and Security Review Commission is a list of all of the Alibaba transactions that have taken place. And they're a very acquisitive company. And it's a big deal to the Chinese. It will create a global economic powerhouse, which in light of what Michelle has said is alone worthy of consideration. Yet other than the size and the amount of money that the companies like Yahoo, which is invested in it, will pull out, there is really very little that we know about the offering, which leads to my second point. I've got three. The second point is complexity breeds risk, and some of those risks are very serious. The structure of the IPO, the way that it's designed, is very complex, and it's designed to get around a conflict of Chinese and U.S. law. Basically, the goal is to make it look like a Chinese-owned company to China and a foreign-owned company to foreigners. And yet you can't both have ownership. So they created what's known as variable interest entities, which may or may not be legal, although they are currently allowed under Chinese law. But there's a risk associated with that, because if they were declared illegal in China, literally investment could be wiped out. And as an investment manager, that's a risk I would be unwilling to take on behalf of my clients. The foreign investors, as it's structured, or as I've seen it structured to make it allowable under Chinese law, will have little or no governance, which is unique. I mean, you buy into a company, you expect that you can vote for the board of directors, and you have corporate governance capabilities, you have shareholder rights. Those shareholder rights are virtually non-existent. It's solely about the money, and what's being offered is you can invest and you'll make a profit because the stock, you know, is expected to rise, a hot IPO and so forth. But that does not offset the corporate governance risks. In fact, the ability to make money was looked at by Hong Kong, and the Hong Kong Stock Exchange turned down the IPO of Alibaba specifically because of the corporate governance risks. In other words, making money is not sufficient. It's ironic that China has laws restricting foreign capital to be invested in their country, but Wall Street appears eager to give a Chinese-controlled company American money, which they can then turn around and use and invest in American companies. In other words, we put up the money, they invest it, and they get the control not only of their company, but also of any other company that they might invest in. Ultimate ownership is very murky, which is another concern. We don't know if there's Chinese PLA money involved. We don't know if there's Politburo money involved. What we do know are reports that a Russian, Usmanov, who's a friend of Putin's, stands to make an incredible fortune off of this deal, which raises a second part of my second point, which is there are very serious risks of economic warfare. I studied that on behalf of the Pentagon, and there's a book that was written by the People's Liberation Army, 2 senior colonels, published by the PLA in 1999, titled Unrestricted Warfare. This is an English translation copy of it. And in this, in Chapter 7, they list stock ownership as an instrument of warfare. In the same paragraph, they also list ways to use any special funds they acquire to influence a country's government and legislature. Now, we've seen the Obama administration complain about the role of corporate money as it takes place in our government. Just imagine that corporation being listed on the New York Stock Exchange but controlled by the Chinese government, possibly the PLA. What level of influence would that $20 billion raised have? It's a serious problem. The Chinese Communist Party has gone on record recently, in 2011, in the official journal, Chesha, of the Chinese Communist Party, declaring that they must confront the United States, that warfare is inevitable and financial warfare would lead that inevitability. State media, as recently as September of last year, called on the world to be de-Americanized and for the dollar to be removed as the reserve currency. The Russians have not only joined them in this call, but they've actually led the call. Sergei Glazyev, who's a friend of Putin, basically said, when we threatened sanctions over the Ukrainian situation, he basically said, if you interfere with what we're doing in Ukraine, we will crash your stock market, ruin the dollar, and destroy your economy. Those same sentiments are echoed in other Putin allies and Putin supporters. In 2008, Russia approached China and said, America looks vulnerable. Why don't we dump on Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac? And if we join together with what China holds and what we hold, we can literally crash the American economy. Apparently, the Chinese said no. But how do I know that? The BBC called this a bear raid plotted against the U.S. stock market in 2008. How did they get that information? It came from Treasury Secretary Paulson, who was warned of the scheme when he was at the Summer Olympics in Beijing. So economic warfare is a serious issue, giving a major company the largest access to our stock market and capital markets in history becomes a concern, especially when we don't know where the governance is and if it involves the People's Liberation Army or others that we would consider to be against American interests potentially. Short of total warfare, Michelle has shared with us espionage concerns, which are very legitimate. Recently, Chinese state media called our iPhone a national security risk to the Chinese, because if you have an iPhone, it has location data. And so they thought, well, that's a national security risk, and they actually called for the removal of the iPhone. Now, if that's a national security risk, what kind of security risk is it if you have a large internet-based platform acquiring Silicon Valley companies and noticing all of our trading transaction information that takes place therein? We know that there are privacy concerns about what Facebook, Google, and Amazon do. We know the Europeans have raised privacy concerns about that in light of Edward Snowden. But at least we know who owns these companies, and we have regulatory authority over them, how they're run. We would not in the case of Alibaba. As Michelle mentioned, there was recently a hacking of databases of Americans with high-level security clearances by, we suspect, the Chinese. She also pointed out Mandian and others have indicated that the PLA is very active in cyber espionage. It is reported that the press accompanying Secretary of State Kerry in China had all of their banking account information hacked, which is kind of frightening. The Chinese have expressed concern over IBM servers used in their financial service industry. They said, we don't want any IBM servers here because that might be the Americans hacking our financial service industry. And yet, the Wall Street Journal has called Alibaba not just an e-commerce company, but literally a bank. And if it's a bank, we're giving them in the cloud the ability, like a PayPal or other payment processing, access to all of our credit card and other information. It's a very frightening thing. Point number 3. The larger issue, and I think the problem that we're really facing, is a problem of American attitudes. We've put money first and made literally money our God. The Bible says that you cannot serve both God and money. And unfortunately, it appears, and the example that Michelle shared also about Charles Lee, Charles Lee at the Hong Kong Stock Exchange said, we will put the public interest first ahead of shareholders. That's why they rejected the Alibaba offering. But the mention that she made was the gentleman who was selling out DuPont secrets to the Chinese. And the quote from the judge says, you have turned against your adopted country for greed. And unfortunately, I think that's the disease that plagues much of the West. We already have Standard Chartered and BNP Paribas paying huge fines for violating the sanctions we have against the Iranians, and in some cases money laundering. And their response was, you effing Americans, why do you have the right to tell us where to do business? Again, it's not a battle for Western civilization. It's about making as much money as possibly can be made. As a result, I think that's where our problem is. We should not let greed dictate whether or not we take this IPO. When Hong Kong turned it down, Wall Street was salivating. They were fighting over themselves. That's why I formed an institute called the NSIC Institute, National Security Investment Consultant Institute, where we're training investment advisors across the country to look beyond the dollar signs and look at the national security issues when they're investing their client monies. It's at the Keating Center of Oklahoma Wesleyan University. Basically, in order to put back the principles that we need to not serve money as our God. I personally believe we should put God back in his rightful place, and I'm not alone in that. Washington, Jefferson, Lincoln, Wilson, Roosevelt, Kennedy, Reagan, and even George S. Patton all echoed similar sentiments in their statements to the public, one of which was Lincoln, where he said, we've been the recipients of the choicest bounties of heaven. We've grown in numbers, wealth, and power as no nation has ever grown, but we have forgotten God. Intoxicated with unbroken success, we've become too self-sufficient to feel the necessity of redeeming and preserving grace, too proud to pray to the God that makes us. It behooves us, therefore, to humble ourselves before the offended power, to confess our national sins, and to pray for clemency and forgiveness. I would suggest that we repent of making money our God, thus denying security for our children and our grandchildren as they deserve. Thank you.
Thank you, Kevin. Next, we're going to drill down further on this theme, that if a company like Alibaba has access to the kind of information that we can anticipate it will through cloud computing or other information stored with it by consumers, by companies, by the agencies, perhaps even governing agencies, with Fred Fleitz. Fred is another veteran of the intelligence community. Indeed, he served for some 25 years in various capacities with the Central Intelligence Agency, the Defense Intelligence Agency, at the State Department, and also with the House Select Committee on Intelligence. He is now a senior fellow, I'm very pleased to say, with the Center for Security Policy and a chief analyst with the Langley Intelligence Group Network. We've asked him to help us drill down on what it means if a company like Alibaba, Jack Ma with the possible connections to the People's Liberation Army, the PLA, or simply the government of China, has the kind of access to both that database and American companies, which are now being bought up left and right, as Kevin said, with money that is being raised in our own capital markets. So Fred, it's good to have you with us. Welcome. Thank you for joining us.
I believe cyber and privacy concerns from the Alibaba IPO are fairly apparent by the way the Chinese government has been dealing with cyber firms that operate within China. And there's some examples that actually touch directly on Alibaba that I'm going to touch on. Last Friday, Google services in China were shut down. They had been started up the day before. Over the last month, they have been subject to a pretty intense crackdown by the Chinese government. Google is basically unavailable to many Chinese. This has been the effect since 2009, when Google stopped censoring internet searches after the Chinese government launched a massive cyber attack on Google in China, trying to target the Gmail accounts of Chinese dissidents. What's interesting about this is, at the time, Yahoo, which was 40% owned by the Alibaba Group, condemned this and said it was aligned with Google and any attempts to infiltrate company networks to obtain user information. The Alibaba company was upset at this, and it condemned Google for making a reckless statement, given the lack of facts and evidence. This is the way the Chinese government deals with cyber companies in China. There are certain expectations that they're going to have to cooperate with the government. They're going to have to cooperate with Chinese intelligence. It's no accident that not only is Google extremely difficult for Chinese citizens to access, but Facebook, Twitter, and YouTube have been basically unavailable for several years. There's about 2,000 websites that have been banned by the government. The New York Times, London Guardian, and the Wall Street Journal have on-again, off-again access. If they offend the government, access to these are not accessible. The New York Times may not be accessible now. I have to check on that. Of course, Google has a lot to answer for in terms of protecting information, sensitive information of its users. In 2007, it settled a lawsuit with the families of Chinese dissidents for providing information to the Chinese government. It led to 2 of them being given 10-year prison sentences. Yahoo has apologized for that, but it simply illustrates the relationship that cyber companies are expected to have in China if they're going to survive. Yahoo last year closed its Yahoo China web portal, which had been run by Alibaba. It also ended Yahoo Mail service in China and directed its users to Alibaba's Alimail. Now, I want to talk about some specific cyber attacks. I'm going to build on some of the things that Michelle said, and one of them touches directly on Alibaba. We know there's been a growing number of cyber attacks against U.S. interests over the last few years. The Wall Street Journal ran an article in April 2009 that spies from Russia, China, and other countries reportedly have penetrated the U.S. electrical grid and left behind software programs that could be used to disrupt the system. The journal article said foreign infiltration of the U.S. power system is not understood, but cited a senior U.S. intelligence official who said the Chinese have attempted to map our infrastructure, such as the electrical grid. So have the Russians. In October 2012, the House Intelligence Committee issued a very important bipartisan study in which it warned U.S. companies considering doing business with the Chinese telecommunication companies Huawei and ZTE to find other vendors because of the likelihood that both companies are cooperating with the Chinese government on cyber intelligence. There has been no similar study of the Alibaba Group, and I think it stands to reason that if there are concerns like this about Huawei and ZTE, the U.S. government, the House Intelligence Committee, U.S. intelligence agencies should be closely looking at this possibility. Washington Free Beacon reporter Bill Gertz said in a March 13 article that sensitive technology and aircraft secrets stolen by Chinese hackers 7 years ago have been incorporated into China's new J-20 stealth fighter. A May 13 Defense Science Board said the designs of more than 24 major weapon systems have been compromised by Chinese hackers. Last month, the Obama administration charged Chinese hackers with trying to steal information on the C-17 cargo plane and the F-11 and F-35 fighters. Now, Shell mentioned that Chinese hackers have also tried to break into the Office of Personnel Management, and that a number of Chinese military officials that are working for a cyber command run by the People's Liberation Army were indicted recently. Something that has not gotten a lot of press is a direct link to cyber espionage, possibly by Alibaba. Last week, the Washington Post reported that Alganol, a California company that is trying to extract energy from algae, was subjected to millions of cyber attacks from China over the last few months. Some of these attacks were traced to Alion Computing, a cloud computing subsidiary of Alibaba, according to the Post. Now, I will add that Alibaba disputed this charge and said Alganon mischaracterized ordinary internet traffic as cyber attacks. I don't know the resolution of this case, but I think it has a significant impact on this huge IPO and the abilities it will give to Alibaba. So, essentially, what does this mean for the Alibaba IPO? The rise of Alibaba marks an effort by the Chinese government to replace Western cyber companies with Chinese firms it can control. Let's make no mistake here. Alibaba is a huge Chinese e-commerce giant and cloud computing company with email operations. To survive, to retain access to the huge Chinese market, to avoid being harassed, to avoid having its executives arrested, it must cooperate with the Chinese government. That is the record we have seen for cyber companies in China. That's why Western cyber companies are either not operating or having a great deal of trouble operating. This IPO will also give Alibaba an enormous window on worldwide economic and personal information. This is not just U.S. economic information, it's information on dissidents, possibly information on U.S. government employees. So I guess I would say to wrap up is that just as the House Intelligence Committee did a pretty good bipartisan assessment of Huawei and ZTE in 2012, a similar assessment must be done either by an independent panel or by Congress, looking at the ties between Chinese intelligence, the Chinese government, and the Alibaba Group, because of the real possibility, given the record of the way the Chinese government manages cyber firms in China, that there will be collaboration and there will be instances similar to what we've seen with Google and Yahoo over the last few years. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. Well, we've addressed so far the issues of security, the very real problem of intelligence collection, of possible compromises of privacy, of proprietary information, and the like by a hostile power. That seems to be completely off the table in terms of official Washington's review of this extraordinary transaction. Well, how about just the deal itself? About the actual practices of the Securities and Exchange Commission in reviewing this kind of transaction. Before I turn to our last speaker's introduction, I just want to mention speaker who wanted to be with us today but was unable to due to travel, Gordon Chang, did an interview with me Monday of this week on our radio program, Secure Freedom Radio, in which he said the following. In Forbes.com, by the way, he's also written an article about this subject. He said, quote, on our show, "This is really going to be a disaster for American investors from so many American perspectives. For one thing, there's a structure which Alibaba has employed in order to list abroad because they're not allowed. Foreigners are not actually allowed to own the Alibaba business. So they've got this convoluted structure which the Chinese Supreme Court has declared to be illegal in a very similar case." Now this is to the point that Kevin's mentioned, that would financial advisors in this country recommend their investors get into a transaction that could be ruled illegal? Gordon went on to talk about Jack Ma, the, as he calls it, leading light behind Alibaba, and he says, quote, "He looks to be a pirate. They've got a leadership structure which is basically going to mean that he and 26 other individuals are going to be running the company with minimal shareholder influence." So maybe we've overstated it. It's not 40 thieves, it's only 27 thieves in this case. Gordon went on, "Jack Ma recently has gone on an acquisition binge, making Alibaba a very different company than the one that has been presented to American investors." And he concluded, and also the underlying business that Alibaba is in is not that good. There is a competitor out there, a Chinese competitor, which is a much better company. So whether you look at this from a security perspective or an investment perspective, this is going to be one of the big disasters of this year, unquote. Let me turn to a man who has spent a prodigious amount of his life, some decades, practicing securities law. He has done so at the highest levels. He is very much engaged in litigation in a number of different capacities, including as the founder and senior counsel of the American Freedom Law Center. But David Yerushalmi has also got considerable experience with, as I say, securities-related matters and legal risks for domestic and international concerns doing business in unstable international environments. In short, I think a very good resource to talk about this transaction just in terms of the merits of the case from a financial perspective and the deviation from the standards that are supposed to be followed by others doing business in the U.S. capital markets. David, welcome. Oops.
I'm the wrap-up, clean-up batter, as they say, so I'm going to keep this short and preferably concise. Kevin Freeman already mentioned some of the areas that, as a securities lawyer, if I'm looking at this investment opportunity and its litigation risk, either from the company side, which I am oftentimes retained to do, or from the consumer side, the individual who wants to buy shares or who has purchased shares in a public offering, what are the risks that I would be looking for? Principally, in securities regulation, we recognize that free markets work, public markets work, like the stock market, based upon 4 principles, and they're well known to everyone. The first and fundamental principle is transparency, certainty, consistency, and predictability. Transparency undergirds all of these 4 elements. If you do not have transparency, and we've talked about the various ways in which this IPO lacks transparency, I'll get into that a little bit, but not too much into the weeds, you are guaranteed at some point down the road to have a problem. That's just been the history of financial investments. And let me just back up and remind this group of one recent example. When we were securitizing subprime mortgages and creating these investment vehicles purchased by fairly sophisticated investors, banks and AIG, which would then provide an insurance policy undergirding those, what was the one element, the fundamental element, that those of us in the business kept jumping up and down and waving our hands and having press conferences as this, and talking to groups like this and saying, this is going to be a problem? It was the way the tranches, the financial packages were rated. The rating companies built this long algorithm on how they could qualify, characterize the investment risk, but it was all based upon assumptions that were simply hidden. They were not transparent to the investors. No one could barely articulate what those underlying assumptions were that went into the risk assessment. What happened? That variable came home to roost, as we say these days, and the entire market collapsed, literally overnight, and dragging with it a host of industrial leaders, including AIG, one of the largest international insurance companies in the world. The same problem exists here, and I would say in spades. First, you have a company that is literally, as Kevin Freeman pointed out, an entire corporate fiction built upon a corporate fiction. We know that corporate entities themselves are fictional entities. They're legal entities. But what do you have here? You have a corporation that is incorporated in the Cayman Islands so that it can register as a foreign corporation on the stock market here through what's called an ADR, which is like a stock certificate, but for those foreign companies. But because the company has to operate in the essential areas in Chinese markets only as a Chinese company, the Cayman Island company cannot own the business in China. So who owns the business in China? The VIE, the Variable Interest Enterprise. And how does the Variable Interest Enterprise relate to the Cayman Island company? You have the stock market company in the US, you have the Cayman Island company that has the relationship with its shareholders, and the Cayman Island company has this relationship with a Chinese company. But what is the relationship? It cannot be ownership. The shareholders in the US to the Cayman Island cannot have that relationship with the Chinese company. So what is the relationship? It's contracts. They build contractual relationships. And contractual relationships do not create the ownership rights, disclosure, and transparency that we all expect when we buy an equitable interest, an equity interest in a company. Problem number one. So that the shareholders now have no way of demanding of the Chinese company certain disclosure, proxy rights. What happens if the business, as we just heard, if the business in China starts to go south, if competitors start to open up the markets? What happens if the Chinese government challenges the use of the VIE? Because in the Chinese legal system, the decision to allow a VIE is ephemeral. They allow it now. But will they allow it in 2 years? Do the companies that are utilizing the VIE have an absolute constitutional right or statutory right to use it? No. That's just not the way the Chinese system operates. What happens if something goes wrong with the business? What do the U.S. shareholders do to sue or to collect assets in the case of a liquidation? Who owns the assets? The assets are all owned by the Chinese company that only has a contractual relationship, and the contractual relationship is only based upon Chinese law. So the U.S. shareholders would have no U.S. law or U.S. judicial system to rely upon. They would have to litigate in China based upon Chinese law without any of the underlying protections that U.S. law provides. Now, my area is securities. So what is the SEC looking at? Well, as we all know, that when the SEC examines an IPO and asks the company to make changes and disclosures, it doesn't care what you're selling, and it really doesn't care what the risks are. The SEC's job is to make sure that all of the risks are disclosed. The question will be whether or not the SEC recognizes all of the risks. Because another area of problem that we have confronted just in the last year is the fact that Chinese auditing firms, even branches of the major U.S. auditors that operate to audit and cover Chinese investments on companies registered on U.S. stock markets, when issues of fraud and prosecution arise, the Chinese branches of U.S. auditors refuse to turn over their working papers. And there is no way for the DOJ, the Department of Justice, or the SEC, the Securities and Exchange Commission, to examine whether or not the fraud exists and to what extent it exists. As a result, an SEC administrative judge has already ruled that those auditors who will not turn over working papers are no longer permitted to act as auditors for public companies, creating another major area of uncertainty. Because if, in fact, there becomes an issue with an Alibaba transaction or IPO or subsequent offering, and we're not able to examine the underlying working papers of the Chinese auditors, there's no recourse except a political recourse, which brings us back full circle to the discussion we've had previously. The SEC's mandate is very narrow. If it were to properly require disclosure in this case, it would be a very, very courageous investor who would invest its funds in this investment. But that's not likely to happen. There are ways to bury risk in registration statements that we're all familiar with. The other elements, though, of regulation in this particular case come from the political sectors, the executive branch sectors. The DOJ, the Department of Justice, has authority over the review of antitrust matters. Alibaba holds monopolistic powers in China to the extent that it is now using U.S. shareholder funds to leverage that monopolistic power. That kind of regulatory concern arises. We have the issue of piracy. Alibaba was on the list of most dangerous violators. It has recently been removed from that list, but that's as much a political analysis and judgment as economic. The fact is that many of the major players in this area, the trade concerns, have all indicated that the level of piracy on the Alibaba network is huge. That is an area that's subject to review by the Federal Trade Commission. But as Frank pointed out in the opening remarks, these regulators have remained very, very quiet. And the question that I have in closing is this: if the investment is not an Enron or not a subprime mortgage securitization or not one of the many vehicles that are covered and cloaked in secrecy, if it in fact is a legitimate transaction without any of these risks associated with it, then why is it that we haven't had that deep level analysis and explanation of these various issues in any kind of transparent way? Ask any of the executive branch agencies that have authority over these areas. What have you done to examine these particular problems that have been raised by the Wall Street Journal, Bloomberg, all the major media outlets? And the answer is a vague nothing. Thank you.
Thank you, David. Well, I hope what you've heard is as troubling to you as it is to me. And I think whether you look at one facet of this transaction or another, it comes across as something that is, at a minimum, problematic and possibly very detrimental to the interests of American investors, the economy, the security of the country. And I want to share with you a comment that it was off the record, so I won't quote the individual involved, but it was a former member of the Securities and Exchange Commission. And he pointed out that the way the SEC works, and I think it's evident in this case, is that as long as there is a disclosure of risk, the people who sort of oversee these transactions before they come to market tend to think, well, caveat emptor, let the consumer be aware. But it doesn't matter how ugly it is, as long as they know, they can make the decision. The enforcement people who will have to clean up the mess if, and I think David's right, when it proves to be a serious debacle, don't get involved until after the transactions are done and there is then something to pursue. This is a microcosm of what I think all of us are talking about in various ways, and that is the utter lack of a holistic approach to the nature of China, communist China, I'm fond of calling it accurately, in these sorts of contexts, and for that matter, many others besides. Is it in fact a hostile power that we're dealing with? If it is a hostile power, why on earth would we be facilitating, especially in a fashion that, as several of my colleagues have mentioned, is so asymmetric to the way the Chinese treat companies that are legitimately doing business, or trying to, in China, not simply arms of government espionage or intelligence of other kinds collection. This is really at the core, I think, of what's afflicting us, not just in this matter, but much more broadly. And I hope we'll perhaps discuss that at greater length with you in Q&A. Are there questions? If you have any, we would welcome them. I would ask you to identify yourself if you can. Do we have a microphone in the front? If you can take that one and pass it back to the back of the room, and just identify your name and organization, if you would, please. In the back of the room.
Hi, I'm Joe Marks from Politico. I'm hoping, Ms. Van Cleave, can you sort of run through the step-by-step of how the Alibaba IPO would raise cyber risks for American consumers and government? Is it that they would acquire U.S. companies that are collecting credit card information, or that they would start U.S. businesses, or what?
I think when you look at the risks to United States security and to the security of our intellectual property, it is a multi-layered issue. There are various opportunities presented when doing commerce, e-commerce, that enable access to personal information about individual consumers. That is an obvious matter. But there also are questions about the possibility of getting involved in acquiring, using the capital that is raised through this IPO to acquire other companies that may also provide access. We're talking about such an enormous corporate entity with such extensive reach in money and riches that has to give you pause. And the thing that concerns me is that, another point that was mentioned as well were the counterfeit goods that are trafficked through some of the Alibaba subsidiaries. Chinese trafficking in counterfeit goods has been a very, very troubling problem. And I guess one has to step back and ask, is there or should there be a means by which the United States government evaluates the strategic implications of an evolving internet, where these platforms are going to be presented by entities like China, in particular China, that do not share a common rules of the road understanding about how things are going to work and a respect for private property, but rather have the opposite approach to doing international business, which pretty much says anything goes. So in answer to your question, I think it's the size of the entity and the vast variety of possibilities that opens up that raises for me the question, should we have a way, a means of evaluating the implications of this? Maybe it's not an isolated matter, but it certainly is a part of a larger developing question about whether the internet and that related power.
Look, can I just offer that, we're being treated practically daily to some insight or other offered up usually by Edward Snowden or somebody like him of what the National Security Agency of the United States is allegedly doing to collect information. I have the feeling that the Chinese are going measure for measure with anything that the NSA has done. And I think what Michelle's getting at, and several of us have talked about, is the likelihood that we're creating new opportunities that are not going to be disclosed properly to the American people, not as investors, not as consumers, for personal, private, possibly sensitive information about them, or proprietary information critical to their company's economic success, will be compromised as a result of this kind of operation taking hold, not just in our capital markets, but in our country as well. And this other point, and I don't know if anybody can comment on it, but there has been already, as I mentioned earlier, a lot of these purchases of sort of boutique Silicon Valley companies whose capabilities to mine information or otherwise access and manipulate or utilize or exploit information can change dramatically the capabilities of a company like Alibaba. So for all these reasons, I think what several have mentioned is this requires really some kind of thorough review, at least of a kind comparable to what Huawei and ZTE got by the House Intelligence Committee recently. Any other question or comment? Let me just ask one of my own, if I may. Hong Kong turned down this deal. How is it that the United States government would not feel at least as concerned from a securities law point of view, from a transparency point of view, from an ownership point of view, from an accountability point of view, on any measure, as concerned about what Jack Ma has in mind here, as were the authorities in Hong Kong? David, do you want to take that microphone?
The Hong Kong regulators rejected the IPO by Alibaba based principally, and this is what I know from public reports, based principally on the requirement that in Hong Kong, public companies must have a unified system of ownership. That is to say, they don't have preferential shares. You don't have staggered levels of ownership or control rights over a public company. The U.S. stock markets do not have that requirement. So public companies can have preferred shareholders that control entirely the company, and common shareholders, the largest bulk of shareholders, have little. Classic example, the New York Times, public company that is controlled by preferred shareholders, a small family group, and all of the public shareholders have no real control or voting interest over the company. But that leads to the other problem that the SEC should have with the Alibaba offering, and that is they achieve that result through the variable interest entity and through the contracts, because the control of this company, this Cayman Island company that's now going to be registered in the U.S. as a public company, comes through the VIE, the Chinese company, because under Chinese laws, we've heard, the owners must be Chinese to be able to operate in the internet space, for one. Those are the control individuals, these 27 individuals. So the SEC should very well be concerned about how it is that it is going to get disclosure and transparency of that Chinese entity. And under current U.S. regulatory law, and it's not possible.
Kevin?
I would just want to point out that was not a small decision for the Hong Kong Stock Exchange. It was a rational, right decision, and it followed the law. But the estimate was directly in trading costs alone, the Hong Kong Stock Exchange would lose $25 million per year, as well as all of the prestige and other ancillary benefits that would have come. So it was a big decision. But they made the right decision. They said, we put the public interest ahead of the shareholders, was the quote in Reuters from Charles Lee. I would also point out that there was enormous pressure on Charles Lee following this decision to remove the regulatory authority of the Hong Kong Stock Exchange that was likely, as far as I could tell, being brought to bear by the Chinese government, which is a big issue in Hong Kong now. There was a mass demonstration recently over the idea that it was one nation and two systems. The people of Hong Kong have been noting that the two systems approach is not working as well as they had hoped. Bottom line is this would be one company, two governances, I guess, in reference to Alibaba, and I think we will find, just as the people of Hong Kong have found, that perhaps the promises that were made initially have not been followed through.
Again, I invite anybody who has questions, and I'm going to ask one more of my own then. Would each of you all have extraordinary skill sets and expertise in a variety of areas. Would each of you talk about this holistic approach problem? Michelle, maybe we could start with you. The extent to which, as you look at this as particularly a counterintelligence professional, what are the implications that we have maybe one arm of the government looking at the little piece of the problem that would fall within their portfolio? For example, the Committee on Foreign Investment in the United States, which says, you know, don't let Huawei, you know, buy up American Telecom. But that doesn't seem to really tie in, though that is a bit of an interagency process. But talk a little bit about how much of a problem this represents as you see it.
Sure, CFIUS doesn't tie in because it's looking at foreign investment in the United States and not the other way around. But Frank, I think your point is exceedingly well taken. I mean, one has to step back and say geostrategy has many dimensions to it. And we see that among the things that the Chinese government is doing to extend its power, including, you know, a 2 decades worth of military modernization at near double-digit figures. One of the things that it is doing to extend its power is it is reaching into the West, and in particular into the United States, to steal those things that it cannot produce indigenously, that it needs in order to gain an economic, commercial, or military edge against us. And it has built an apparatus to be able to do this, which has tasking and resources, and we've identified it and we've been hurt by it and we've seen what's happening. And yet we seem to be just stumbling along without a coherent way of dealing with that. A coherent way of dealing with that would start with a national strategy that says it shall be the policy of the United States not to permit a foreign government from acquiring unlawfully U.S. technology. And if that in fact were a declared policy of the United States, it would have strategic sinews. And it would say, these are the review processes by which we are going to look at transactions such as this that could change access and opportunity in a significant way, that could be contrary to the objectives of a national policy not to permit these things to happen. There's an implicit policy that says, well, this is wrong, and there are individual laws that say that it's wrong, but lacking a national strategy that orchestrates the different elements within government, the different regulatory bodies, other review bodies, that might enable policies to be promulgated coherently from beginning with the intelligence community and all the counterintelligence work that goes across into in the commercial realm, into intellectual property realm, and how do we approach power as it's exercised through the internet. These are emerging questions, and having a strategic 30,000-foot view that says all of these parts have to be pulling together or we'll never get anywhere is the beginning of wisdom.
Very well said. Kevin, in particular, what I'm interested in, I guess, from your study of things like unrestricted warfare, is not only the lack of the holistic approach on our side, but the skill that the Chinese, notably, but not exclusively, have engaged in exploiting that lack of holistic sort of strategic thought and execution. Would you talk a little bit about that?
Sure. What we see as a global marketplace, others around us see as a global battle space. They don't view it as a global marketplace. We assume a Western viewpoint that all transactions are economic. All transactions are for the purpose of profit and profit exclusively. That is not a Chinese concept. In fact, quite the opposite. There is a holistic, it's an expression of power, not just economics. So they have 5-year military plans. They also have 5-year plans for the country as a whole. We have separated national security from economics. We did that with the fall of the Berlin Wall during the Clinton administration in particular. We just said, hey, you economists, go make as much money as you possibly can, and the national security will build the best, biggest defense that we possibly can. So our military expenditures are large, and our economy is large, and both. The Chinese have seen that as a vulnerability, and they express it directly in this book, Unrestricted Warfare, and they essentially say the Americans will never get it. The Americans are too linear in their thinking. They won't take a holistic approach because the business people will say, hey, as long as we're spending enough money on defense and we have the aircraft carriers and the fighter jets, then we're fine. They don't realize that that is not how the Russians, the Chinese, the North Koreans, the Iranians, and others have perceived the world. They view us as too powerful militarily, therefore they have to attack us in non-military ways. So it is an essential part of their strategy to, number one, have a non-kinetic approach to warfare, as outlined, and number two, to make every effort to make certain that the Americans never adopt a non-kinetic approach to warfare. And so there's an enormous amount of influence money in Washington coming from various nations. In fact, I gave a speech at the Heritage Foundation, and up walked an individual with a card that was a Chinese studies professor at one of the major universities, and I said, did I characterize unrestricted warfare improperly? And the answer was no. No, you got it exactly right. And I said, can I assume that you're somehow connected with the People's Liberation Army? Yes, you could assume that. And I said, well then, what are what's your response to this? The answer is basically, Americans will never get it. I wished I'd had a tape recorder and could have recorded it and shown that was the answer. You'll never get it, and that's what they say in this book. We have to adopt a different stance. That's what Putin has done. That's what the Iranians and so forth. So, bottom line is they're taking advantage of our linear thinking with a holistic approach, and that is their strategy.
Fred, this is sort of related to Michelle's portfolio too, but I just wonder, from your experience in the intelligence community, which is fairly extensive, to what extent is it bringing a holistic approach to this that may not be integrated properly in the policy space, or is it equally sort of, well, I guess what do they call it? Stovepiped in its view of these things and contributing to the problem as a result.
I think the 2012 House Intelligence Committee study on ZTE and Huawei was an example of how there is not a holistic approach to this. Why was there not an intelligence assessment that came out with the conclusion that ZTE and Huawei were such a threat? Why didn't the Justice Department, the Commerce Departments come up with this, the State Department? The reason is that the threat isn't being taken seriously, and the information is not being amassed in the right areas where people can draw conclusions. But another problem, and it's both within the intelligence community, within the U.S. government, and within the corporate world, is that these threats are being dismissed or being argued away. And I think that's gotten worse recently because of the Snowden leaks. We know that Snowden leaked information supposedly because he was worried about the privacy of Americans, and then he went on to leak information concerning Huawei. Apparently he wanted to also protect the privacy of communist Chinese leaders also. But by these leaks, the Chinese have been able to argue that they're a victim, not the perpetrator of cyber espionage. And don't look at us, look at the NSA. But the reality here that I don't think is being grasped by the media or by corporations, that there's a vast difference between the offensive cyber operations of China and the defensive operation of the United States. China is using cyber warfare to target foreign infrastructure, to identify dissidents, to harass, arrest, or kill, to steal industrial secrets. The United States government does not steal industrial secrets with our intelligence capabilities. We use it to defend our nation. But the debate over the Snowden leaks have gotten so out of hand that I think China's been able to take advantage of them by drawing some moral equivalency between their intelligence operations and what we conduct. And that no one's been looking at the entire picture to see what is at stake here. Then we have the Alibaba thing come up, and I imagine some of the things we're saying here today will be written off by people whose perspective has been so distorted by the debate over intelligence over the last year that they're not going to listen. But maybe some of the press reports from this event will change that.
David, to you, the question of a holistic approach seems, particularly important. It would appear, particularly based on what we've just heard from Kevin, that those in the securities business, most especially, are inclined to look just within the very narrow confines of their responsibilities. I'm reminded that at the initiative of Congressman Frank Wolf, there was an office, I think they call it the Office of National Security Affairs or something like that, at the SEC, that has been a bastard stepchild inside the organization for all of its life and has, as best I can tell, not been engaged in this particular transaction. Should it be, and would that be just one example of ways in which we ought to be bringing a much more informed understanding of the nature of these suitors for our capital investment in a holistic fashion?
One thing we know about securities regulation in the United States, actually two things. One is it's one of the more extensive reviews and regulatory agencies in the world covering public markets. It's the most sophisticated. Having said that, the second thing we know is that it knows and deals very poorly, knows very little and deals very poorly with international companies. Once you have a foreign company registered through an ADR, which is just the mechanism used to have shares issued by a foreign company, the SEC simply has no mechanism. It has this little office within the SEC that deals with some of these risks associated with foreign companies, but it's not staffed. It's not part of the analysis that's going to go into this particular IPO. This IPO has been assigned to an attorney and an accountant, and they will go through the boxes and make sure all of the disclosures are made. But they will not look at all holistically at the various questions we've talked about here today. even at the level of the financial risk for the investor. Because each of these issues that we've talked about, even in the national security area, we know provide reputational risk to companies. One of the great sections of risk in a registration statement for this company or any other foreign company is the area relating to the reputational risk related for a foreign company operating in a different legal environment. If you don't know exactly how the Chinese courts, and more importantly, the Chinese government, which controls the courts, is going to respond to any of a myriad of legal problems that will arise with Alibaba, like any company, Google, Yahoo, right here in the United States, have enormous regulatory and legal issues. We deal with those relatively transparently in the courts. There's a constitution, there's statutes, there's regulations, and there's litigation. You don't have any of that in China. So how does the SEC require the requisite disclosure in the registration statement for this company to properly provide the information to the public investor? Heretofore, the SEC has very, very little track record, and what little track record it has in requiring this kind of disclosure is abysmal.
Last call on any questions from the audience? Yes, sir. One more.
So two things are being said, one of which is that this is an exceptionally large IPO and so merits special attention, but also that there's not a sort of standardized whole of government approach to this sort of thing. I'm wondering if you can talk a little bit about what the approach ought to be for smaller IPOs of China-based companies, and if the same kind of oversight would be necessary for other countries with a reputation for economic espionage, such as Russia or, in some ways, France as well.
Good question. Who would like to strap that on?
I can start just offering a perspective. You know, one is often asked, why single out China? And I think when it comes to cyber activities, China gets singled out because it's just such an overwhelmingly large player in the field, and because of the extent to which it's been extraordinarily successful in exploiting its presence through the internet to achieve certain national ends in ways that are disadvantageous to U.S. interests and to that of the Western world. So China has made such a national policy of developing power in cyberspace, that for that reason it merits special attention. Certainly the Russians are no slaggards either when it comes to these activities, but it's China's vastly quick expansion and growth in this area is especially noteworthy and troubling, and I think that's why you see so much attention paid to the Chinese. Does that mean that every Chinese owned IPO that comes onto the market would be reviewed in this way? I think that when one develops standards in doing these kinds of reviews, they ought to pertain to, to all comers. So the way in which the CFIUS works, looking at foreign investment in the United States, it's the kind of thing where there is a referral that it's not looking at all potential investments in the United States. It's looking at ones that rise to a certain level of concern. The standards are there, but the mechanism gets triggered through voluntary filing. I am not smart enough when it comes to international commerce to know if a similar kind of structure could be used when it comes to SEC reviews of potential IPOs. I defer that to my colleagues who might have thoughts about that. But we certainly have found ways to deal with the larger players, the greater concerns, because those are the ones that tend to rise to the level of national security concern.
Anybody else?
Yeah. I thought I'd provide just a little perspective empirically on this. We pulled the list of Chinese registered companies in U.S. markets. Chinese ADRs. There are 208. Now, there are a lot more public companies than 208. So in terms of the numbers, that's a growing number, and it's relatively recent, so there's a lot of growth there. But objectively, that's not a big number. But let me just read to you the market capitalization, the value of the top 10 companies. I'm just going to run down the list, giving you numbers. 230 billion, 224 billion, 199 billion, 181 billion, 151 billion, 145 billion, 127 billion, 108 billion. Now it goes down to thousands of dollars, but it shows you the value that's being generated by Chinese-controlled companies in the U.S. markets. Now let me just read to you the list of industries in those top 10 companies. Oil, banking, wireless, banking, internet, banking, oil, insurance, internet, insurance, wireless, e-commerce. These companies are strategically placed in exactly the right industries, creating, from just the list that I've read to you, close to $1 trillion in market capitalization. Now, if that's not something that grabs our attention, it certainly should be grabbing someone's attention at the Department of Justice, at the SEC, at the Treasury Department, all the areas that we deal with on a daily basis, even for domestic concerns doing business internationally. I spend a lot of time in offices and agencies talking with bureaucrats who are asking about various risks, but again, because it's stovepiped and it's not holistic analysis of what any particular company is doing. I can walk from one agency to another, tell one story and then tell the opposite story to the other agency, but it's what they want to hear, and no one's going to connect the dots. And that's the problem I see here.
Yeah, I would just argue that size and strategy matter, and it's the nature of this offering and the ones that David mentioned. As an investment manager, we would make investments all around the world in all kinds of markets with all kinds of disclosure and so forth, and that's not a problem. What's unique about this is that they're accessing enormous amount of American capital, and in doing so, Wall Street celebrates, it hits CNBC, everybody sees, wow, what a big thing, and all of a sudden that gives to the American consumer some type of seal of approval that this is a great thing, and it's additive so that it creates national security risk upon national security risk upon national security risk. Whereas if you were buying into a German bootmaker that sold exclusively in Germany, it wouldn't be such a big thing. Or any country that had good corporate governance, it's not such a big deal. Here we have a multiple of risks combined, which is we're investing large amounts of American capital that would go into a notably hostile country based on their cyber espionage efforts in a systemic important industry that has virtually no governance, and the law, it's actually against the law in China to do what this IPO is going to do according to the Supreme Court, but it's whatever the PRC says at the time is acceptable, whatever the party says is workable. But when you add all of those together, you've layered national security risk upon another. So size matters, the strategy matters.
I think that's an excellent summation of really what we've been about here. Let me just add one other point, which goes in a way to the question and something that Michelle alluded to. There is a larger policy issue here. What is the United States government going to do to remedy what clearly is a vulnerability? And I think Kevin has addressed this as have others, that is being exploited by a hostile power, in this case China, and probably by others, namely the stovepiping. Michelle and I have been talking about the Committee on Foreign Investment in the United States. Evidently not going to be involved in this transaction, but it is an interesting model. It is an interagency group that is convened as she mentioned, when something triggers a requirement for a review. It's not by any means all of the transactions that I think probably warrant that review, but it is a subset of them. My experience in the Pentagon a long time ago was that that group, and subsequently, that group is chaired by the Treasury Department. And I think it's no surprise exactly, and certainly no secret, that the Treasury Department is favorably disposed towards foreign investment in the United States. It helps with their mission. There is an export control counterpart to CFIUS. I don't know that it's got a formal title, but it is a similar kind of interagency mechanism. It is led by the Commerce Department. And in my experience, the Commerce Department has never seen an export that it didn't think was a good idea. The importance of having at least a process that brings into it some of the agencies that might have a different view, who might say having Huawei buying up American Telecom actually has security implications, or having various technologies go out the door to hostile powers actually has national security implications, is a sensible thing. I don't know that we're structured as efficiently for doing it, or that the naysayers have as much influence in the process as they should. But I think an interesting thing that's come out of this conversation, and that certainly ought to be part of what we discuss going forward in the aftermath of this deal, is what on earth are we going to do to try to organize our government so that there is a multi-dimensional review of these kinds of transactions, that it's not simply left to one particular element of the SEC, for example, which, as I said, simply goes through, or others have mentioned, goes through a sort of due diligence checklist. And as long as they're satisfied that the boxes have been checked and the risk is being properly disclosed, anything goes. That's crazy. And I think the degree to which it could be not just crazy but dangerous has been very helpfully illuminated by my colleagues. I want to thank Michelle Van Cleave, Kevin Freeman, Fred Fleitz, and David Yaroshalmy for their expertise and their participation in this program, and for yours as well. We'll be making this available through the internet, and I hope that it will stir further discussion, debate, and corrective action on this particular transaction and those that are almost certainly in the offing. Thank you very much for joining us, both those of you here and those of you via the internet. We're adjourned.